One of the intelligentsia has decided to descend from her ivory tower and dispense orthodoxy and wisdom to the masses, or at least to those still reading Esquire Magazine. Esquire published an article entitled The Problem With Canon on November 2nd, and wow! Adrienne Westenfeld, Esquire's books and fiction editor, and who covers books, edits fiction, and curates the Esquire Book Club, ventured forth to opine on something that, by my reading of her and her article, she really has no idea what she's talking about. I know, bold statement. However, I think she gives me enough rope in her article that I can hang her with said metaphorical rope. Calm down, Mama Susan. She does not open very strongly, as her subhead states, Rings of Power and Star Trek Strange New Worlds did the impossible, adapting behemoth pieces of IP without pissing off fans. For the most part, in parentheses. Turns out Star Wars and the MCU have much to learn. Unquote. And her first three words show she already is starting from a place of ignorance, duplicity, or idiocy. It is entirely possible it is all three. One can never know these days. The first paragraph reveals how the rest of the article will go, claiming toxic fans to be the problem of mega franchises, even though said mega franchises continue to falter under decisions not made by or for fans, but by activist studio heads, producers, directors, writers, and actors. It was not fans deciding to buy Star Wars to continue its legacy and start by checking out the extended universe and outlines by George Lucas, and then very loudly claim they had no material to work with, that they had to reinvent the wheel George Lucas already made obsolete. It was not fans deciding to rewrite the history of Star Trek by involving time-traveling Romulans and diverse female space Jesus. It was not fans deciding to rewrite the entire history of the Doctor, giving the Doctor a massively retarded backstory nobody was asking for, thereby destroying the mystery that made the Doctor so special. It was not fans Well, I could spend the next hour doing this, and we all know the record of the last couple of decades. So let's move on. Miss Westenfeld seems to think that fans owe their favorite franchises their time, money, and love, no matter what third-rate hack is put in charge of the IP by the megacorporations that own them. They don't. And she also seems to think that it is beyond reasonable to expect the history, including canon and continuity, of said franchises to be respected by those who work on them. Not to the extreme where everything has to be perfect. Most fans understand there will be adjustments and adaptations. There has not been a single comic book movie adaptation or show adaptation that was even close to perfect. If the movies were good, fans loved them nonetheless. But that is not what is happening in Hollywood these days. No, what is happening is that people with little to no talent, people who oftentimes hate the IPs they work on, see She-Hulk, cannot make up new properties because they lack the creativity and imagination. Instead, they latch on to existing properties and infuse all of the messaging they want to propagate using the old IP. And when fans of that IP find it is complete crap, the studios engage in their current favorite pastime, fan baiting. What is fan baiting? It is the approved marketing tactic of ginning up media coverage for a project by calling fans istophobes of various kinds, depending on the demographic of the actors that they have cast. The media covers it, and when the movie comes out to poor ratings and meager box office numbers, they can point to the istophobe fans as the excuse, while also saying such people are a small minority. They are such a small minority, how did they make the box office numbers go down? Don't know. Continuing on with the article, Miss Westenfeld gets no better with paragraph 2 by showing she is not part of any fandom. She misrepresents fans' feelings toward canon, portraying them as doctrinaire zealots. She seemingly does not even know simple fan complaints about failed franchise offerings over the last decade plus. Railing against fans' attacks on storytellers who dare to expand canon using J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson as examples. What is her evidence to support this? The fact that petitions exist and have a large number of signatories to decanonize The Last Jedi. I know. Monsters! Who would dare to hate such a masterpiece of cinematic triumph as The Last Jedi? And, of course, wanting to adhere to canon is just code for bigotry. She does not join the chorus of entertainment media shills by repeating oft-debunked examples of such bigotry. She merely lets it float out there without leaving anything for someone to come along and prove her wrong. What she seems to ignore in all of this vapid blathering about canon is the fact that there are plenty of examples of projects that were not only wildly successful at the box office, but were also wildly popular with those very bigots she is blaming for the current state of Hollywood. You know, fans. The people who keep franchises and IPs relevant in those times between movies or TV shows, or books and comics. The ones who shell out for the merchandise, devote hours to talking about them online, go to conventions, and watch good franchise products over and over again, and thereby pumping up those box office numbers they are accused of depressing for the junk movies. And then buy the hard copy media when it comes out in that format too. In other words, the people the owners of IPs depend on to make franchises, you know, franchises. And the reason articles such as this exist is that the people in charge of those franchises hate the very people who fill their pockets and allow them to do what they do. They chafe under the restraint that fans place upon them. And this is evident in the slop they have been releasing in the last half-decade plus. They would rather create what they want and make everyone pay them for it, but their projects would not sell. And even the ones that they slap pre-existing IP names on are failing at this point. The article then goes on to point to a quote by former Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica writer Ron Moore. Quote, "It's frustrating to be in the writer's room and tossing out stories and then having to stop and go, does this work? Does this violate continuity? And having to call people and check encyclopedias and look up information. You want it all in your head," unquote. She claims that abiding with canon conflicts with creating art. I will get back to the whole continuity thing because it is important in the context of the article. However, if you are a writer playing around with someone else's ideas and think canon is too restrictive, then you probably accepted the wrong project. If that is your attitude, then you do not belong writing on projects that did not originate with your ideas. That is how we get a Star Wars sequel trilogy that fails to have Han, Luke, and Leia on screen at the same time just once in 3 movies. That is how we get She-Hulk, who spurns the idea of being a hero. That is how we get Warrior Galadriel, with a fraction of the power and ability of the real thing. One that fails to recognize Sauron as Sauron, despite making eyes at him for 6 episodes. Westenfeld then goes on to praise Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is not surprising since critics have it at 99% on Rotten Tomatoes. I have heard mixed things about the show, and nobody I have heard is as complimentary about it as she is, even those few who think it is decent. Not great, decent. What she likes about the show is that it expands canon, something she claims to hate, and fills in the edges of established lore. There is an unfortunate downside to this kind of thinking as well. Filling in the edges is how we get origin stories for things that don't need origin stories. And more often than not, said new origins are retarded or surrounded by retardedness. Ask Doctor Who fans how they feel about the Timeless Children. And what did you think about the Prey origin story for the pistol from Predator 2? Or Han Solo's pistol in Solo? Or even Han's last name in Solo? Or what about that origin story of an entire effing mountain in the Rings of Power? I bet the volcanologists out there love that one. Do I hate the idea of writers tinkering at the edges of IPs, flushing out the gray areas of the main stories? On principle, no. But the writers in Hollywood these days do not have the talent to do that sort of thing, nor the restraint to hold themselves within the boundaries of those gray areas. Nothing pointed that out more than the Rings of Power. That show was intended to be the very sort of thing the author of this article is talking about in this paragraph. However, from almost the beginning of the first episode until the closing credits of the last, the gray areas had expanded to include canon and continuity-shattering alterations to major characters and events in both the stories that came before the Rings and those that come after. They simply cannot help themselves in their cultural vandalism, and it has nothing to do with fans' obsession with canon. Which leads nicely into her next paragraph, wherein she praises the same approach Strange New Worlds took in Amazon Prime's Rings of Power, pointing specifically to the storyline of Elrond in the series. She then spends some time carrying water for Amazon, defending the decision to include probably Gandalf in the series, despite the fact that he does not appear on Middle-earth until 1,000 years into the Third Age. She thinks it is better to let hacks play with the stories of other, better artists rather than obeying canon. And it was at this point that I became a little confused. All throughout the article, she talks about canon almost as if it were a curse word. In this section, however, she seems to be using canon and continuity synonymously. I began to wonder if she even knows the difference, especially where franchises are concerned. Canon is the overall world/universe the story takes place in. The rules and constraints the writer places on himself or herself. Continuity, on the other hand, is the string of events in said world into which the story is placed. If something is screwed up vis-a-vis continuity in Star Wars: Attack of the Clones, then the rest of the franchise coming after it in time doesn't make sense. Canon mistakes can be less or more jarring, depending on how bad they are and how integral they are to the storyline. And Miss Westenfeld does not seem to make a distinction between the two, as she uses canon to rail against istophobic fans who demand adherence to one or both of them. And this dislike of both canon and fans comes through in her final paragraphs. Once more, she goes back to Ron Moore to advocate for a rather expansive approach to adaptations. She writes, "But canon isn't purely good, by definition, and sometimes it restricts storytelling. For a story to endure and expand decade after decade, as all the mega franchises have, it must be adaptive and reactive. That's the very soul of adaptation." She justifies this idea by using the "other minds and other hands" quote from Tolkien, wanting to give writers the ability to come along and change whatever they wish as they play in other artists' sandboxes. She adds in Ron Moore's experience with Star Trek, where he says he felt quote-unquote straitjacketed by canon, wanting to approach it like, quote, "This was version 1 Trek. Love it. Celebrate it. Watch it forever if that's your cup of tea. Go ahead. Let's have version 2. Let's have another Starship Enterprise with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and let's tell a different version of events. Look at Shakespeare. How many versions of Cleopatra can the world stand? As many as you can think of. Let's just do a different take on it and get energy out of it and not worry about all the backstories. You want Trek to be fun, so make it fun, unquote. And that last bit is exactly why current Hollywood does not understand its audiences. The Trekkies and Star Wars geeks and Doctor Who fans and comic nerds find fun in those backstories that feel so much like a straitjacket to Ron Moore and Adrienne Westenfeld, McKay and Payne, Gow and Feige, Kennedy and Hidalgo. That they come to despise the very foundation upon which they are standing as they try to expand the franchise goes to show they either hate the property they are working on or they simply do not understand it. Again, either through ignorance or stupidity. Or maybe just towering hubris. Westenfeld writes, quote, "In the age of corporatized canon, perhaps wanting these storytellers to tear up the rulebook is too much to ask," unquote. Using Ron Moore to justify this idea of tearing down what has come before in order to allow those who have been given existing properties, with existing fan bases and existing worlds pre-written, to play with. And more often than not, these days, these people wind up breaking those franchises. The list is too long to run through, but most of us were fans of one or more of them. And this claim that fans rise up in a wave of bigotry and violence at such violations is usually lacking receipts. At least receipts that don't smell of bots. These days, the studios and actors are not even bothering with receipts. Have fans always voiced dismay and displeasure at change to IPs? Yes! But it is the story and the respect and the effort that is put in to win over fans that usually carries the day. Going back more than 3 decades to the casting of Michael Keaton as Batman, we find one of the prime examples of this. Fans were outraged that Mr. Mom would be Batman. What did Keaton do? Well, he didn't pay a lot of shill journalists to write hit pieces on the fans. He didn't pout about it at every chance he got for the media. He didn't let the fan revolt affect his work in a negative way. No, he buckled down and tried to win the fans over, with both his media appearances and his performance in the movies. And it worked. He is still one of the favorite Batmans of most Batman fans. Hugh Jackman, Ben Affleck, Heath Ledger, Evan Peters were all cast in various franchises to the dismay of fans and are now fan favorites. Why? They worked to make the characters good, and the writers behind the projects were not throwing in things to deliberately piss fans off. And if you think that is an exaggeration of what currently is going on in Hollywood, I refer you to the interviews Jessica Gao and Tatiana Maslany have been giving post-She-Hulk finale. Or just go watch the last episode of She-Hulk. Adrienne Westenfeld ends her piece with a ubiquitous quote used out of context and missing a part. Quote, "When it comes to canon, it's true what they say. If you love something, set it free." Unquote. And that one sentence ably sums up her entire premise with this article. If you love a franchise, let other people burn it down. Love it anyway, bigots. After all, it still says Star Wars or Star Trek or Doctor Who or Terminator or Marvel on the page, so it must be the same thing you always loved. Only now it is better because someone I like has, quote, reimagined it, unquote, or, quote, adapted it for a modern audience, unquote. The full quote Miss Westenfeld misused is, quote, If you love something, set it free. If it comes back, it's yours. If not, it was never meant to be." Unquote. Hollywood has gotten a lot of fans to the "if not, it was never meant to be" stage of fandom grief. We have hit apathy, and while it is sad for us fans, it is downright devastating to those whose existence counts on us going to the theaters to watch their movies, sit in front of the television to watch their shows, to buy their merchandise, and to carry the franchises forward into the future between projects. I think studios like Disney thought they could cut us out by never having an in-between period, spamming us with content on Disney+. But Drek is still Drek, be it on the big screen or on the little screen. And apathy is apathy, no matter where the Drek shows up. But the good news is that Hollywood is beginning to lose their hold on creative endeavors, and independent artists are beginning to break through the monopoly. Add in increasingly excellent art from places like Korea, Japan, and Spain, and there are new horizons for fans to find. Even if they do have to suffer through subtitles or bad dubbing. That is all for this video. I will post the link to the article in the description along with my social media and Patreon if you want to look at the article yourself. If you like what I do here, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share the video, and leave a comment or constructive criticism down below to help out with the YouTube algorithm. I will see you in the next video. Tschüss.